Hi, everybody. This is Claas Ehlers. This is Claas in 60 Seconds live on Facebook, where we have really interesting conversations with fascinating people on topics that overlap with the issue of family homelessness. And as you probably know, Family Promise is the leading national organization addressing the issue of family homelessness. And I'm really excited about today's show because it's a little bit different. The topic is really pervasive throughout the issues of family homelessness, but maybe not always in ways that people think about. And it's not something I think that people know that much about, and that is restorative justice. And I myself, don't know that much about it. And my guest today is going to do a great job of educating us. But I just wanted to share some initial opening thoughts. So crudely, as I understand restorative justice, the issue is that there is a transgression there. When there's some kind of act against a person, uh, not only does it create the offense or whatever, but it creates an obligation because we're all interconnected. We're all a community. And the imperative becomes to how to repair whatever that transgression was, whatever was broken, whatever was damaged, whatever was hurt. And I think this is really critically important because when we look at criminal justice in this country, it is incredibly problematic. There's tremendous disparities. It's clearly not functioning well. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we focus on penalty and punishment as opposed to actual solutions to issues like repair and restoration. When you think about the commission of crime, it is consistent if you control for age and gender, which is to say, people commit crime pretty much at the same level, same rate, except that younger men of whatever background tend to commit more crime. But the punishment of crime is anything but consistent. A man in his early 30s who grew up in poverty is 20 times more likely to be incarcerated. And that has to do with not with the poverty per se, not with any other issues, but it has to do with how we choose to define crime, which crimes we choose to police, where we put our resources towards that, and then how we punish, right? What crimes do we incarcerate for and what ones don't we incarcerate for? So it's an issue related to poverty. And because poverty is tied with race in this country, it is also an issue of race. It's not the only factor in it, but it is also an issue of race. So tying this back to Family Promise, we have 6 core values, and there's a couple of them that I think really go into the concepts of restorative justice: community and empowerment. And I'm not going to be talking like very specifically about crime, but one of the things that we do at Family Promise, one of our key objectives has been to get affiliates to lower barriers, right? To serve as many people as they can and not create these artificial restrictions. So not to penalize, punish people because they don't have a car, they don't have a job, they have a substance use disorder, they have a criminal background, or whatever it may be. Because ultimately, it is systems that have forced those people to be more vulnerable and has pushed them into homelessness. And ultimately, I want to kind of pull this out more broadly conceptually. So you've got sort of the nitty gritty of people commit offenses and we want to take an approach of restoration and repair. And it's kind of like, why do we do apologies if we do something wrong? But the bigger issue here is that there are systems and people in power who commit a lot of offenses, who have committed the offenses that allow these disparities to exist. So we need to look at this on a systemic level to say, how do we get our systems of power to embrace a restorative, reparative approach? How do we get our systems in power to bring back, to heal, and to uphold their obligation to the community? So those are my rambling thoughts. My guest today is going to do a fantastic job of taking my half-baked ideas and turning it into a beautiful meal. And that is Annabelle Berrios, and she'll be joining us shortly. Aloha, Annabelle.
Hi, Claas. Good to see you.
Likewise, I'm saying aloha because Annabelle and I met in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
We were both staying at the same bed and breakfast. We just got to talking and understood we actually had this connection of social service. So, Annabelle, we'll start off with how did you first even encounter restorative justice? Like how did you even realize what it is?
Well, I think I would have to tell you a story
I was hoping you would.
about the place where I was born. And there's so much about restorative justice that is about storytelling. So, I was born and raised in a close-knit community in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And I was thinking about those words very precisely before I came here. Close-knit community. Because I think there's something about like the close-knit that allows for containment and for holding, right? And if you had asked me back then when I was a kid what a close-knit community meant, I would have told you that everybody was a busybody and nobody could mind their own business. I think if you asked me now, I would tell you that people knew what was going on in each other's lives and checked in on them, offered support. They were present. There was a consistency of presence in each other's lives so that people weren't really falling through those cracks as easily. And I have to tell you about the entrance to my home because everybody entered my childhood home through the kitchen. My mother refused to do the official entryway. So when you would enter, you would be met by smells of coffee and onion and garlic, rice and beans, and the stove was pretty much always on. And it was hot. It's a tropical place. So you imagine the stove is always on, and there's like a fan in the background moving the air, and people don't even care because we're kind of all huddled in the kitchen and the countertop, telling stories. And this countertop, if that countertop could speak, would have heard stories about new loves, divorce, coming out of the closet, school trouble, family drama, all kinds of things. In fact, my friends were so close with my mom that after I went away to college in the States, they still dropped by for lunch. And I don't think my mother ever ran out of food to feed people. But look at what happens when you have a home and you have hearth and you can tell stories and you can connect, right? And one night, my neighbors were over, and I was about 13 years old, and they were aged 8 and 11 at the time. And it was about 10 o'clock, and mom wanted to go to sleep. And I remember that these kids were afraid of calling their mom to go home because they were supposed to wait until she called them to be able to come home because she gave them permission to come home. And they were afraid of telling their dad that this dynamic was going on. And I got a sense that maybe the divorce happened because there were some unhealthy dynamics between mom and dad. And, I was that kind of kid that was always about like fairness, and this is unfair and this is not fair. And, the mom should let the kids back in the house. What's the problem? And I immediately wanted to call somebody, do something. And my mother said, wait, wait. And she said, I'm going to make a phone call. I'm going to talk to this other mom. And, they lived next door. It used to be a two-family home. And it got split where the rental was upstairs. And this was unusual in my neighborhood. People had their own homes. These were mostly traditional families. There were two lay nuns, and there were some elderly folks whose kids would come in daily to kind of look in on them. And I don't think this person was used to maybe being looked after or being seen in that community. Maybe she felt a little left out on hindsight. So mom calls her and they have a conversation. And the first thing she expressed was her concern for the kids because she didn't want to let these kids, she wanted to go to bed. And I'm not going to let these kids go out at night alone on the street. The second thing she expressed was her own needs around like some boundaries and limits. And then she offered her ears and listened. And what we learned was that this single mom was handling two jobs at the same time to make ends meet. And that she was so afraid of losing her home and losing her ability to feed her kids that it was all coming out like as anger towards her kids. And what happened that night was that my mom and her had a conversation, and they were able to come to a decision that supported our needs, that supported this family's needs, and a friendship was begun. And then that person became visible in our community. And that person became part of that weave. She was no longer out of the loop or falling through the cracks. So I didn't know that there was such a thing as a restorative conversation back then. But if that was a there was a restorative conversation, that would have been it. And I think some of the elements of that restorative conversation was that it was a voluntary conversation. The other person had the ability to say yes or no. That my mom knew enough about her own thoughts and feelings, but could also regulate them, because she had plenty of judgments about the situation, but she withheld them, and she was able to listen to a different perspective and connect. And that together they could come up with a solution. And that really stayed with me. And the reason I bring it up as a foundational story is because you mentioned that we look often to restorative justice as a response to harm and violence. But actually, restorative justice at its very core is about building community, building trust, and building through community. And that community can be a protective factor for communities and community members, and a preventive factor as well. And to just say something about what you said before about the interdependence, I think that that's absolutely spot on. I think that that's a really strong and guiding value. It's like that recognition that kind of like we are embedded with each other's, our lives are actually really embedded with one another's. And if somebody falls through the cracks, actually the rest of us suffer. We may not notice, but that we suffer, and we owe this. And I want to make sure I credit the native people who have given us a lot of these technologies, and like Circle, um, and people of color, frankly, that this was a thing that was done, that was not called a separate thing, because it was part of a way of looking at the world, and that there are Western and native roots to this practice, and everybody does it differently.
Thank you, Annabelle. That is absolutely wonderful. And it calls to mind two things. One is just one of our core values is hospitality, and hospitality to me is simply saying sharing with others without judgment. And when you can get people to embrace an attitude of hospitality, then you melt away a lot of these other elements. And to the other point that you made too, I mean, I think about truth and reconciliation, Uruguay and South Africa. I think these are sort of embodiments of that concept, because we have to look to the future. We have to look to restoration. If we are constantly looking at penalty and punishment, we're just simply creating deficits that must keep being refilled. So, is there anything else that you would sort of put into a definition of restorative justice?
Yes, I would say that restorative justice is practiced very differently depending on the community, and there's not like a one uniform way. Um, and there's many different ways in which restorative justice is held and practiced. One of the ways in which I hold it, I think about justice and what is meant by justice, and often I hold it as a question, and that question is, whose justice? Because sometimes do we want to protect ourselves and our own interests out of fear? And that's just a valid human response and question to ask ourselves. So whose justice, right? And what do we mean by justice? um, is it about fairness? Is it about restoring wholeness? And if it is about restoring wholeness, then that wholeness includes as much our virtues as it does as our shortcomings. And restoring, maybe it's not to come back to something, but maybe it's about restoring our ability to see, restoring our ability to see more deeply, maybe even to see what's hidden and below the surface, to restore the what I call the frayed webs of community, that they start, with our busy lives, right? Like my aunt has been ill and she's 95 and in assisted living. My life gets busy. How often do I go to see her and visit her, right? So, but it's not the same if I hold her hand than if it's somebody else that doesn't know her that holds her hand. So maybe it's about kind of like reweaving so that we're all held. And that's what I mean by whose justice, right? What if it could be like a way where we're holding all each other for the benefit of everyone, and not in an adversarial way, and where we can learn from our mistakes to deepen our relationships and have the intimacy and the maturity required to have relationships that bring us safety and thriving for everyone, right? So a little bit differently than how it's defined in a lot of spaces. But it's a very personal one to me. I do want to reference a fantastic book that is called Listening to the Movement, Essays on New Growth and New Challenges in Restorative Justice. And in particular, um, the introduction about restorative justice taking the pulse of a movement, that was written by Sonia Shaw and Carl Stauffer. And I believe there's a link that can be offered to folks in the chat. Um, and the reason I do that is because it really lays out very interestingly, the different kind of evolutions of restorative justice as a response to harm and violence in particular, although not exclusively. So, for instance, it has started as a program, like many people have heard of many restorative justice programs, right? Or restorative practices that have been used with a program. Let's say, for example, inside prisons is one way that this has been seen. But then it has also been held as a paradigm shift, right? And it has been like, well, if we actually have another way to go instead of going, for example, through the juvenile justice system, is there a way to divert young people, have restorative justice diversion, where there's an alternative where folks are being held that way and being allowed to self-reflect on the harm that they've caused and have the opportunity to make amends and make things right in a way that is dictated by the people they harmed, which is not the person directly that they harmed, but their community, their family, in a significant way. And could there be a paradigm shift here from looking, like you were referring to, from looking at harm, responses to harm, from punishment to obligations sourced in that truth of interconnectedness? But then it just continues evolving, like it's a social movement. It's about embodying those values in everyday life. And then it's even further restorative justice as a social justice movement, which touches what you said about truth and reconciliation, which Fania Davis speaks so beautifully about. Um, Racial justice is being intertwined into this, and how racial justice and restorative justice are like a lot of I'm a lawyer, a recovering lawyer, so I will use this term, inextricably intertwined. I think it's interesting that even the law has a word for that, inextricably intertwined, although used a little differently.
I hearing everything that you're saying, I think sort of it's such a central concept, and we can all apply it. Just thinking about it very simply, that most of the time when we're transgressed against, what we want more than anything is just a sincere apology, mm-hmm. Right? Like that's the most simple form of restorative justice, because it brings us in connection and community. It satisfies sort of our interconnectedness and our obligations, and it allows us to move on. Right? And you can think of how many times the lack of a sincere apology has allowed a problem just to, between two people, between whatever, to just continue to fester and grow. How would you see, I talked a little bit about how I see like this concept really being sort of embedded within Family Promise in all these different ways, because creating community is so central to what we do. How do you see it connecting to the issues of homelessness, particularly family homelessness?
Well, one thing that happened during this pandemic was that this, rush, move everywhere when we were shut down, shelter in place. I couldn't do the same thing. And, where was I? I was sheltered in place. I had a home, right, to be sheltered and placed into. So I just want to name that's quite a, that this is not a given, right? That not that thing that I took as a given, oh, I can work from home out of my laptop, is not a given. And it's actually very disruptive, and was very disruptive for millions of people. But one thing that actually helped me in slowing down was two things. One is that I had to be more intentional about how I was connecting with people. But also, I started slowing down and noticing things that I didn't notice when I was going really fast. And one of those things that I wanted to name was displacement. Displacement. It's so painful to live with displacement. It's so painful to notice the people who don't have a home, that are living under the underpass and the highway, when I take my walks around the neighborhood. And I want to name that I live on land that was settled and colonized, and that was already occupied here. There were people who were residing here. The Ohlone people were living here. And a reminder of that I have is the West Berkeley Shell Mound, which is near me. And that's a parking lot right now. It's the Spengers parking lot. But for the Ohlone and Lejeune people, who are the original people here, that was a native burial ground. And by the way, I'm not speaking on their behalf, and none of what I'm saying is representing them. But but walking by there all the time and noticing what was happening, noticing the litigation that was happening, as there's a desire to build housing there, oddly enough, right? Is like, can I sit with the truth of displacement? How many assumptions do I have about why people are displaced and how they got there? Do I believe that it was because they deserved it, or they did something wrong, or they did something that they could have avoided? I think of that mother from way back when I was a kid, that was doing everything she could. I'm thinking of people who are in situations of violence, that have to leave and have nowhere to go. But what about, since you brought up systemic, racism and systemic issues, what about the original people that were displaced, and who are highly, not hardly, highly invisible in everyday life? They're here. It's like hidden in plain sight, but I can walk by that all the time. And if I really build the capacity and I really sit with that I am benefiting, because I am benefiting. I live in Berkeley, California, in a beautiful apartment, and I benefit from the fact that this area was settled. What are my obligations here? No shame, no blame. But like, how do I sit with the pain of that? And how does that grow my capacity to be in response to that? And what might be my obligations as a person who lives here? Not out of this, but out of care, out of love, out of noticing that the phrase of, that the weave is not tight in some places, and some of us have fallen through the cracks.
I love that, Annabelle. Thank you. And yeah, I think the concept of displacement is really such a powerful one because, again, if we think of the term, just think of the term restorative, reparative, right? That's displacement, again, is a transgression. It is, and that's why I think the concept of restorative justice, you need to really refract it all these different ways. You can have the literal thing of, like, the kid broke the neighbor's window, and so then he helps clean up the yard. Like, that's like this very simplistic definition of restorative justice. But it is putting it out through everything and looking at it in the terms of how we all interact in the society, and everything that is a transgression needs to be addressed through a restorative lens as opposed to a punitive lens, right? If we actually want to progress and grow. So the last thing I'll ask you is, what would you like people to think about? What are your comments? What are your challenge? I'm sure they're going to be challenging comments, actually. What are your comments about restorative justice and how people should be sort of placing it into their frame of reference?
Well, I think that my intention coming in was that maybe there's ways of connecting that restorative practices are something that is inherent to who we are as people. And it's a way of practicing humanity, dignity for everyone, and care and being in relationship. Um, so I think what I have, I don't want to bring shoulds. I want to bring invitations, because a restorative mindset is voluntary and always about consent. So I think that the first invitation I would put out to people is to ask yourself, do you know your own patterns? Do you know your own patterns of response? Like, I know about myself that I sometimes get like, oh, things should be this way or that way. And what my mother taught me when I was a kid was to pause. That was my first lesson in pausing, that there was something really noble in that. And yet I could pause because maybe what I was seeing was just a slice of something, and that there's way more, maybe, that just that little slice of the thing that I'm seeing. Could I just open a little bit, a little crack into that? There could be multiple perspectives on something. So I would say, it starts with that inner work. Like, do I know my own patterns? Could I invite a second, third, fourth different perspective into this situation? And who are the people that I care about, and how do I show them that I care about them? Am I consistent with them? Am I trustworthy? Can they count on me? And it starts with small things. It starts with little things. It starts with my 95-year-old aunt, who is the last living relative in my father's line, for me to like touch her back after she's had ankle surgery. um that there's a building that is happening there with that consistency and that trust. Can people tell me the truth? Am I willing to listen to a different perspective? How can I make it safe for people to tell me the truth, even when I don't like what they're going to tell me? And for what purpose? Is it to just win? Because as a recovering lawyer, let me tell you, that urge to win is another thing that I have to suspend all the time. But what if it were about like our shared well-being? So that's one thing. And in terms of that other piece of community, I think it's about, what can I get curious about? Where do I live? Who was here before? And if I didn't look at that through a lens of shame or blame, but just as a lens of curiosity, a lens of wanting to understand, and just go on that journey and breathe a lot and build capacity, not really to do anything necessarily right away, but to look away. I knew I was going to see you today, and yesterday I passed through somebody who was sitting under the bridge by themselves, with a sleeping bag and lots of boxes. And I challenged myself to breathe, to sit with my feelings, to notice my thoughts about what came up, about what I should do and I shouldn't do. And I think my desire and my prayer is that I can build a little more capacity to be with those hard things, so that there's more space for a heartfelt response that feels true and unique to my own situation. And that's what I would hope for the listeners as well, for them to find their own way of expressing what's most important to them and the caring that is in their hearts.
Annabelle, thank you so much. I think that um, this is a wonderful conversation to have before the holiday, which is ostensibly about thankfulness and gratitude. And these are the sorts of ideas, again, it's the lens we need to refract that holiday through, because there's so many things about that holiday that are wonderful, and there's so many things about that holiday that bark right loudly towards these issues. So I will wish you a wonderful weekend, and express my gratitude for you sharing your time, your wisdom, your grace with me and with everyone. And it's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
All right. So uh, I love doing these, and this is just such an interesting and dynamic and expansive opportunity to have this conversation with Annabelle. And I'm not going to say much sort of in summation, because I think she said so much so well. But what really struck me is actually the concept of visibility, because I think part of the inclination to penalize and punish is, as Annabelle sort of referenced it, right? It's part of it is a compulsion to win. And part of the way that we treat penalty is to make something not visible. And I think what's so critical in Family Promise is that we do make everything visible. We make people visible. We make the issues visible. We make our own discomforts and shortcomings visible as well. And that's, to me, one of the key things I'm drawing out of this. One of the things I'm thinking about is what are we making visible? What do we need to make visible? And how do we restore the injustice of the invisibility inflicted on so many in so many ways? So with that, I am going to wish everybody a wonderful weekend, a wonderful Thanksgiving, although think about some of the other meanings of Thanksgiving. And I just am thankful for everybody that supports Family Promise, everybody that's engaged, everybody involved with affiliates. You're doing amazing work. You're doing restorative work. And I have to say, thank you.